We are at Hearth, and I am here with Chef Marco Canora. Thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you.
And so in front of us, we have bone broth, which is the subject of your new book, Broth, and your restaurant next door. Tell me a little bit about what bone broth is for the uninitiated.
It's simply bones and water boiled together for a really long time. Add some vegetables. The resulting liquid is bone broth.
And so what?
Or stock.
Right.
Or bouillon.
Right.
Or
so
broth.
what makes it different? You know, people who say, well, that sounds an awful lot like stock. What differentiates a bone broth from a stock?
You know, there's a lot of discussion about that.
Right.
And some of it I believe, and some of it I don't. I don't think there really is a difference. Some of the paleo community folks claim that a big difference is that bone broth is cooked for a longer amount of time, sometimes up to 48 hours. I don't necessarily buy that. They typically go overnight, 18 hours, sometimes 24 hours, but never more than that.
Is there a certain point at which you've extracted everything you can from the bones?
Yeah, like the chicken broth, for instance. After you cook chicken bones for 12 hours, if you saw the resulting bones, they are what I call spent. I mean, they have given up everything they're going to give up. And I don't think that boiling them for an additional 8 hours is going to, you're not going to get more out of it.
What bones have you found do well in broth that perhaps people aren't as familiar with?
Neck bones. Neck bones are really great because the structure of a spine is one of which that is very difficult to strip the meat off of. So you end up having bones that have meat on them.
Right.
One of the biggest mistakes I see people making when they try to make bone broth at home is they use beef femur bones, which is the marrow bone.
Right.
And I personally think it's the worst bone to make broth out of because it's a long, smooth bone, so it's very easy to strip all of the meat off of it. So you'll end up boiling just bone and fat with water. There needs to be meat on the bone if you expect to get good flavor and also protein.
When you're thinking of bone broth to drink, as you have at Broth, are there other things that you can add to it? Because the broth that I'm drinking has some coconut milk, some ginger. How do you think about taking broth from something that people use in a soup to being something that you can drink, like your cup of coffee?
Broth is a great canvas for flavors. I mean, we have 3 base broths: the chicken, the hearth, and the beef. And I'm constantly thinking of things to add into it because it's just a perfect kind of neutral, savory platform to add flavors to. So right now I think we have 8 or 9 add-ins. It's almost endless.
What flavors meld well with broth, and what have you found in your tinkering was surprising that it really didn't work well?
Well, one of the things for me is that I want them all to have kind of a healthy halo, right? Because this is an incredibly nutrient-dense, kind of nourishing beverage, and I want the add-ins to kind of jive with that. So, we're doing things like turmeric and ginger and garlic and all these like anti-inflammatory, like high flavor things. I'm thinking about starting to enter the whole Japanese repertoire of stuff. So, adding fish flakes or ground seaweed or different miso pastes, I think could all be really delicious. In terms of things that don't work, well, for me, it has to integrate into the liquid as a liquid. The rule is it has to fit through this little sippy hole.
Right, you're not
going
to
get exactly. That kind of limits us in a good way.
It makes it a drink rather than a soup.
Exactly. No, I think that the hot beverage market has been the same thing for decades.
Right.
And I think everybody's kind of hungry for an alternative. And I think broth can fill that void. And it checks a lot of boxes. Dairy-free, and it's gluten-free, and it's sugar-free, and it's high protein, and it's low calorie. And then on top of all of that, it's incredibly tasty and satisfying and filling. So I think it's got a lot going for itself.
Where do you think that people should begin if they're saying, okay, I'm getting started for the first time? What are the easiest bone broths to make, to store, to kind of get started with?
I think chicken. I think people eat whole roasted chickens, and you could start by simply, instead of getting rid of that carcass, chop it up, put it in a freezer bag, and do that 5 or 6 times, and then use those bones to make yourself your first chicken broth. But for something that's so simple, because it is simple, you literally boil
bones.
Yeah, you boil bones. Like it's not a chocolate souffle, right? However, as with most simple things in cooking, they're not always easy.
Right.
So there's a lot of considerations, and we touch upon them in the book. Things like ratio really matters. Things like the size of the bones really matter. Like for instance, if you use a chicken carcass, it's like a big balloon, right? There's a lot of negative space.
Yeah.
And if you fill your pot with 3 carcasses, it takes up a lot of room in the pot, and then
Right.
you cover it with water. And the ratio of bone to water is one that's going to yield a very watery, not good broth.
Right.
But if you chop those bones up, then you get more bones in the pot, less negative space. Your ratio of bone to water is one that's more conducive to flavor.
Yeah.
So things like that, ratio is a big one. It's a great platform to play with flavors. I mean, it's a great way to take flavors out of things by boiling it for a long time. So things like parsnips, for instance, add a really nice sweetness, like beyond the carrot flavor.
Yeah.
So I've played around with that. Celery root is another good one. Sweet potatoes is interesting because it adds starch and it adds viscosity and consistency. So that's a good thing to play around with. Dried mushrooms like shiitake add an immense amount of umami and depth of flavor. That's really cool. So yeah, there's so many things to play with.
So keep playing and get the book.
Yes, get the book. Learn how to make broth.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for talking to us about bone broth. Really appreciate it.
It's my
I'm
pleasure.
gonna say cheers with our drink,
Cheers.
not our soup. It's broth.